One thing I'd like to introduce you to today is really about the world of Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is known as an open source system for automated deployment, scaling, and management of containerized applications. So Kubernetes is such a large and big, it's had such a big influence on the world, that a lot of companies, if they're not moving to Kubernetes, they know about it, they're starting to learn about Kubernetes. It's certainly got its own huge amount of followers. It's a very, very big subject because you've got to think that, Kubernetes themselves, it has multiple features and multiple components into the Kubernetes. But for today, what we're going to try and do is just consider about the actual containerized applications in the Kind and the Minikube space. So for testing Kubernetes, to actually start and have some type of framework onto your system, what we need to do is we have to have a cluster. And a cluster is basically a number of nodes working as one system together. So that's exactly what a cluster is. But what we need to have are a few tools that could allow us to run and verify some Kubernetes or containerized applications management onto our own machine. So two tools that provide the functionality. One is called Kind, and it says Kind is a tool for running local Kubernetes clusters, which is a group of nodes, using Docker container nodes. So Kind was designed for testing Kubernetes itself, but may be used for local development. So this is a great tool because what it allows us to do is say, hey, I don't want to stand up a full Kubernetes instance right now. I want to learn and play about it on my local machine, on my local Mac, on my local Windows system, and understand what exactly Kubernetes is. In the next sessions, we'll get more into Kubernetes. And one thing we will also look at is also the Certified Kubernetes Administrator exam. So this is one of the most popular exams. This study is not easy. The Certified Kubernetes Administrator exam, it's not easy, but it is certainly achievable with a lot of practice. So this exam is very, very hands-on. So we will look at that. It's only one of the actual exams on the Kubernetes. There is others. But for today, we look at the tools that will allow us to run a local Kubernetes cluster. So one tool we have is Kind, and the other tool that a lot of people use is actually called Minikube. So you'll remember that as part of this YouTube series here, I've put up new session 4 Kind and Minikube notes here. So really, all we actually have to do, and if you're looking to get into learning about Kind and Minikube, and again, these are two tools that allow us to have a cluster locally on a machine, but allows us to practice a little bit of Kubernetes for containerized applications. So if we go to our session 4 here, obviously the first thing to always do, as we've discovered in the previous sessions, is always make sure that you have the documentation open. Read a little bit about the documentation, understand what Kind is. Kind is something that I actually use quite often in my day-to-day job, because it allows me to sort of say, well, I have this test image and I have a tag, and all I want to do is basically test this test image. I don't want to have to go to a full Kubernetes deployment with everything installed and rerun everything. I want to test something locally on the machine. So when I look at this is Kind, and going back to our GitHub here, the first thing you would actually have to do in the Kind world, so let me just open up a command line here. The first thing we'd actually have to do is actually create a Kind cluster. And this again, it's basically the defaulted basis of saying, it's going to use this node version, and a node is a computer, and it's basically going to start my control plane, and the control plane is in Kubernetes. Basically, it tells us, it controls everything around the scheduling and various aspects of the Kubernetes. But for today, it stands up everything that we need to do. So right now, it's actually had installed I had installed Kind, but now what I've done is I've actually just created a Kind cluster, very, very simply. So it's just going to use one default node. That's okay. That's okay for now. It means my local machine. And if I go into Kind, and again, these are command line, interfaces. So, really getting yourself familiar with command line, I can see that I actually have a cluster called Kind Test. Okay, so I know that my cluster is Kind Test, and it's up and running right now. Now, I won't get into it today because it was such a distraction from Kind and Minikube. But really, what you're looking to do is always have an actual pod, and the pod in Kubernetes is the smallest piece of you can think of component that's available. It's the smallest component that's actually available in Kubernetes world. So, I can have a pod that runs Apache. I can have a pod that just does some little feature, but a pod is basically the smallest piece within the Kubernetes world. So what I can sort of say here is I actually have a YAML file here. So Kubernetes itself, and don't forget that, Kind and Minikube, they're both, Kubernetes clusters, but Kubernetes basically uses YAML. So if you're not, aware of what YAML is, I definitely recommend that, you would go and research about YAML. But for right now, what I'm just going to do is actually just going to create a little pod.yaml file, and I can sort of see here that, my pod, which is called simple pod, has been stood up with this Ubuntu image. Well, this name here and this Ubuntu image, and I've got a little command in here that you can specify any commands into Kubernetes pods. But you can see that the actual image here is Ubuntu. And that's basically what this pod, the smallest component of a Kubernetes cluster, will basically pull down. So if I, for example, if I come out of that and say, okay, so let me create my pod. Now, to run any commands within inside of Kubernetes, you have to have another tool, which is called kubectl. So I also put this at the top of these notes here of how to actually install kubectl. So kubectl is the tool that will basically interact with the Kubernetes cluster. So let me I've already installed kubectl. So all I'm going to do is basically saying, hey, Kubernetes cluster, please make sure that you create this pod. And you can see that now the pod called simple pod, okay, has been created. Now, if I go back here and I say, get my pods, get pods, you can see that I have simple pod and it's now running. Okay. Now again, this session right now, it's not about Kubernetes, but this is really the basic principles of Kubernetes, because really what I have is, I can say get nodes, and you can see, the node that we stood up here. So preparing nodes, installing control plane. This was one node, and it gave it that name. The role was on the control plane, and the version was this. That's exactly the version that we have here, and you can see that it's up 3 minutes. So this control plane node, which is here, to Kubernetes, which is an actual Kind Kubernetes cluster, it allows me to create pods. Okay, so I can do get nodes, and I can see my node, and then I can do get pods, and I can see my pod is running. Okay, so my pod will basically be running on my node. Okay, how do I know that? I can specify another command here with kubectl. I can say get pods -o wide, and I can see my simple pod is running with an IP of this, with the name of the node here, which is my control plane here. Okay, so that right now is looking good. Everything's up and running. Everything looks fine. My node is running. And again, if you were to basically put this into your own environment, so you were basically to stand up your own Kubernetes environment into your own work environment, it takes an awful lot of work. It really does take an awful lot of work, and then you have to secure it. You have to make sure the user access is good. But this just allows us to do a quick little Kubernetes cluster really quickly. And then what we can do is basically we can actually delete that cluster. So we can just remove it down, and we can run this command here, and we can sort of say delete and cluster. And now if I was just kind of go back up here and sort of saying, well, you know, get my clusters here again, you'll be able to see that the cluster is actually officially gone. Okay, so no Kind clusters found. Now, that's a little bit about Kind. Okay, and when you kind of look over into Minikube, you know, Minikube is another version of Kind, and it allows you, it says Minikube is local Kubernetes focusing on making it easy to learn and develop for Kubernetes. You know, all you will need is Docker. Now, Minikube is what some people would use, Kind is what some people would use. The point would be that, you know, don't limit yourself to down to one or two certain tools as cloud solution architects. Try to advance and understand as many of these tools as possible, because even if, you know, and some of these tools would be DevOps tools, but even if you don't use them every day, it's critically important that, you know, your team possibly are using this, you know, and what's the limitations and how does this work together, you know. So understanding what your teams internally do, you know, also makes it easier for you to architect in a better way, really. You know, and there's in this one Minikube, it needs a little bit more capacity on CPU and 2 gig of memory, 20 gig of free space. You know, it needs a little bit more, you know, than Kind, because Kind just sort of says, well, unless you provide me, you know, configuration of what you want to do, I'm just going to create you the defaults, which is going to be really small. But with Minikube, you know, it needs a little bit more, but it's still the same idea. You know, you basically get to install Minikube, and then you'll basically get this started. So let's sort of see if our Minikube has been started. Okay. So basically what it says is, okay, and this Minikube is going to be this version. It's going to be on a Linux system, which is, you know, because basically I'm running on a Mac here, but starting control plane node, Minikube in cluster Minikube. It's pulling the base image. And again, you know, you can see here that even this, where it says it's pulling a base image, you know, this goes back to where we have images running in a local environment, but this image could technically be running onto a production system, you know. So it says I'm preparing Kubernetes here on this version. Now, when we get to look into this exam, you know, in the next sessions, you basically sort of see that the versioning of Kubernetes is really important. It starts to become really important so that you're preparing for the exam in the correct way. But essentially, it sort of says here that it's actually done. kubectl is now configured to use Minikube cluster and the default namespace by default. Okay, so that basically means again that we can sort of say kubectl get pods, and because Minikube now has taken over from Kind. Okay, so Minikube has now sort of said, you know, I'm going to be the kind of master of this system now. And I can sort of see here that kubectl get pods, there's no resources in the default namespace. Now, the default namespace and namespaces in general is something that we will cover in next episodes or next sessions. But for today, you can just think that the default is just the default area. So this is just an area storage space that, you know, Kubernetes Minikube basically says, I'm just going to use whatever's in the default, okay? So you don't have to worry too much about that right now. But you can see that, let's sort of say, it says here we can create a Kubernetes deployment using an existing image. So I could do this. Could take that command here. This sort of says create deployment. And again, a deployment is where you would actually have a deployment, and these deployments can be quite big, to be honest, but as an essentially low-level introduction today, it's really where you sort of say, I want to make a deployment with a certain image. So please do my deployment of this name using this image. That's all you're basically specifying here. So you can sort of see that the deployment has been created. Okay, so my deployment of Hello Minikube has actually been created. So that deployment has taken this image and technically taken the image and put it up into its own little storage space, which right now is the default namespace. Now, I could also actually just do something here, kubectl get deploy, right? So I can sort of see here that, kubectl get deploy, which is shorthand for get deployment. I can see here that my deployment name is this, and there's 0 ready of 1, and there's 1 up to date. And this is the age here, it's 33 seconds. Now, we're not going to worry why this is 0 of 1 right now, just right now, but I should be able to do this here. Should be able to expose. So as part of your deployment, you always have to expose the service, and there's multiple ways you can do this. But you can think of the deployment as saying, well, I have to be able to get to my deployment. And how do I get deployment? I get to it through the service. Okay, and here if I sort of say it says get URL of the service here. Okay, so it gives me a service name. Now this is probably not going to work because this is probably not going to work because there's something actually wrong with this deployment here. Okay, so we'll need to actually have a look and understand what's actually the issue on that. If we go back to our notes here, we can delete a service and we can delete our deployments. Okay, so we can do those two, and I can actually stop my Minikube. Okay, so I'm actually shutting down my Minikube again. Okay, shutting down my Minikube, and I'm going to actually delete my cluster here. Okay, and so one node. So again, Minikube just set up one node, and here I'm going to say Minikube delete. Basically, it says here removed all traces from Minikube cluster. Now, the reason it didn't work, in the actual browser. So if you've seen session 3 of this, you would have sort of seen that we stood up a little Nginx image, but really it could be any number of reasons. But really, if you actually have a good image, and probably this requires a little bit of permissions, this image or something like that. So when you actually create your deployment, you have to expose the deployment. So if this had worked, and we could see that our deployment was up and running, and we had exposed our service, so we'd sort of said, use the port. So don't forget that everything in Kubernetes, it can be done on the command line or it can be done in the YAML file. But here you're specifying various aspects of the deployment here. So you're basically saying it's a node port, and this is a certain type of deployment and service, and this is the port that you're looking to expose it on. But really, it's just trying to make sure that our actual Minikube today is up and running. So I hope that you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you.